So I want to welcome you to the first of 3 salons that are sponsored by the ACRI Director Development Committee. My name is Lenny Levis. I'm the chair of the committee, and other committee members are Lori Nisco, who's sort of in charge of the video right now, Jaime Romo, put your hand up, Jaime, and then also Nancy Wilson. Nancy couldn't make it, so she had sent in some comments and questions and participated quite a bit in the formation of these 3 different salons. This is our first one. And so, so before I introduce Dr. Ed Shapiro, let me just say a few words about the format for the salon. Recording is going to be happening, so I just reminded you of that. The plan is that we will interview Ed with some questions and discussion points that we have developed as a committee and submitted to Ed prior to this meeting, so he knows the kinds of things that we're interested in discussing with him. And the plan is that the committee will conduct the interview and discussion for the first hour, and then we will open the last half hour for all of your comments and thoughts and questions and considerations. And we'll ask at that point that you use the Zoom function where you raise your hand as it appears on the screen to queue up for participating in it and asking a question or making a comment. And we'll be monitoring the Zoom chat, but we don't intend to use it to direct questions to Ed until later in our time together. And, any questions about that? Lori, anything you want to add?
Just to add that, please keep yourself muted just to avoid distractions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, and so let me, the name of this presentation or this first salon is called Why Do It? A conversation with Ed Shapiro on his experience as a conference director. And I like the question, why do it? We're going to come right to it in a few minutes. Let me just introduce Ed first and give you some of his background. And many of you know him, of course, but just to press a refresher for those of you who do, and for those of you that don't, you'll hear some of his accomplishments. Ed has an MD from the Harvard Medical School. He has a master's degree in anthropology from Stanford. He's part of the distinguished faculty at the Erik Erikson Institute for Education, Research, and Advocacy. He's the former medical director and CEO of Austin Riggs Center, clinical professor of psychiatry at the Yale Child Study Center, a board member for the International Dialogue Initiative. He's on the advisory board for Partners Confronting Collective Atrocities. He's a principal with the Boswell Group. He's an author. His most recent book is entitled Finding a Place to Stand, Developing Self-Reflective Institutions, Leaders, and Citizens. He's the author of many articles on topics related to group relations. I counted at least 20, there's probably more. Ed has been a fellow of the A.K. Rice Institute since 1991. He's directed multiple conferences and trained countless members of group relations staff. His article, Learning from the Director's Role, Leadership and Vulnerability, can be found on the ACRI website under the Director Development tab on the resources page. And I encourage you to all look at that when you get a chance. I'm going to begin with a couple of questions for Ed, and then ask some other committee members to raise some questions, bring up some discussion points as well. So Ed, let me jump right in and say, why do it? Why take up the director's role? What made you decide to take on the director's role initially? And why do it in today's climate? Those kinds of things. So jump in.
What made me decide to take up the director's role initially was that Margaret Rioch asked me to do it. There's no way I would have had the courage to do it because it terrified me. And anybody who isn't worried about taking up that role isn't paying attention. I think that having somebody who has done this work before, who encourages you to take the risk to take up a director's role, is crucially important. Because having somebody behind you, if it's an organization, maybe. If it's somebody you value, even better. So there's a burden placed on those of us who've been experienced in the work to recognize people who are getting ready to do it and to encourage them. It worked for me. I never would have done it without her encouraging me. I said, there's no way I understand. I said to Margaret, there's no way I understand how to do this job. It's being in a membership scared me. I learned a staggering amount. Being on the staff was wonderful. I had this experience. I was on a staff, my first staff role. Roger Shapiro was directing, and Wesley Carr was a much more experienced staff member than I. And in the middle of the conference, I had this experience. They were having a conversation in the staff room about the conference. And I could tell that what they were talking about was incredibly important, that it mattered, that something that they were seeing, I needed to understand. They were speaking English, and I didn't understand anything they were talking about. And the competition and the need to understand was part of the drive that made me want to learn more. So for people who are thinking about this role, talk to people about it. It's worth doing. As for why do it, the reason to do it is there's a staggering amount to learn from taking up the director's role in all kinds of areas. You learn how to work with an organization, you learn how to take authority, you learn how to develop a staff, you learn how to delegate authority. You know, I just learned last week that there are organizations that are called DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, that they're all about the kind of thing that we learn in conferences, where you authorize staff to take up a role and you trust them to do it, and you learn from them. And you learn how to manage a staff, you learn how to manage an organization, you learn how to market. When I took up the job at Riggs, the place was in trouble, and I had to learn how to market. And the work of doing group relations conferences helped enormously. The reason to do it is that our world is in chaos, and people are being mobilized by systems irrationality that they don't see clearly. And we have a tool that allows people to see it clearly. That's why I do it.
And do it more than once.
And do it more than once. The first time I did it was in Boston for a weekend conference. The first time I did a residential conference was because Harry Holloway, who was the director, resigned because of the sickness of his wife. And I took up the role. I was the associate director, and I'd never directed a residential conference before. And so I threw myself on the mercy of the staff, and we figured it out together. And I learned a lot from that. So it happens.
Great. Well, thanks. That's a great beginning. Laura, you want to jump in? You have something you want to add?
Absolutely. So, you know, this series has been developed by the Director Development Committee. So we've been thinking a lot about, you know, training and development and what is needed. So how did you develop, what was your development like in terms of getting ready for this role? And what do you think is necessary and helpful for people who are interested in potentially taking up a role like this?
I had a lot of training. I was trained as a psychoanalyst. I spent 2 years in Washington at NIMH working with Roger Shapiro and John Zinner, where they were studying families. And Roger was one of Margaret's original people who did group relations work. And so he and John used a group relations methodology in studying families at NIMH. And I was so blown away by that when they closed that unit, I started a similar one in Boston. All of that family work and psychoanalytic studying helped me an enormous amount. But most importantly, I think, is membership. I was a member in three residential conferences before I worked on a staff. And as everybody who's listening to this conversation knows, those experiences are transformative. Not everybody who takes up the director's role needs to learn how to do family treatment or psychoanalysis, but they do learn how to take seriously what irrationally is happening around them. And I think membership is where it matters.
There's something about being able to apply it right away into a work setting that you're talking about also. That is, it adds on to the learning, and also the provides an integrative function right away, that you have a work setting where you can take your experiences and apply them, the application.
Well, when I went to my first conference, I had just started a new program at McLean Hospital, and I was having trouble in the institution, and I was blaming it on everybody else. and then I went to a conference as a member, and in the institutional event, I was leading a small group in the institutional event, and we were having the exact same problems that I was having in the institution, and I couldn't blame it on anybody. I had to take responsibility for my contribution, and that mattered a great deal.
Right. When you decide to stand up and say, I'm going to make an organization around myself, I'll be the director. It's like, what do you expect is going to happen? If it's not going to show you something about yourself that maybe you weren't aware of, right?
Well, that's actually the deepest learning, I think, of all of our conference work, is that you don't form an organization around yourself. You form an organization around a task. And being led by the task, that's very hard to teach. But if you can help people figure out how that works, then, and you can demonstrate that when you're in charge, you can follow leadership from below that articulates the task more clearly than you can. That experience is a transformative one. That's the difference between being led by a leader and being led by a mission.
Ed, that's a nice segue to I want to ask then about what your approach is to staff selection. Is that probably a two-part in this, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, when I started out, what I thought about in terms of selecting the staff was to distribute the loci for projection as widely as I could get. So that meant old people and young people and different colored people and different nationalities and all of the loci that society uses and exploits to project. And that as a matrix for understanding systems irrationality is very useful. I also learned, painfully, not to hire my friends. I worked with Wesley Carr, we wrote books together, and I hired him to do a training group, and it was almost the end of me. So we didn't lose our friendship, but I learned a lot from that.
So related to that, so thank you. Thinking about identity, how does yours and staff then factor into who you're putting into different roles?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I know the answer to that. I think it happens. I hire a staff without predetermining what the roles are. And then I look at the staff and something happens. Some form of collective combination of rationality and irrationality happens. And I assign the roles. I don't do it ahead of time. And sometimes I don't do it. I mean, I've directed maybe a dozen conferences. And I sometimes it happens. Sometimes I discuss it with the staff. Sometimes I assign it ahead of time. It varies. I increasingly, with more experience, trust the way the collective irrational focus shapes our work, rather than trying to control it. I've given up on control. I think it's a fool's errand.
And so could you say more about, like how task then determines your choices?
Well, the biggest mistake I made in directing was the infamous 1990 conference, where I decided, because the institution, ACRI, needed it to do a training group, and I had never experienced one. And so I hired Wesley to do the training group, but I had never experienced one. So my directorship was not quite behind what he was doing. and it got me into all kinds of trouble. I think that I don't know how to answer your question, Jaime, in terms of assignment of roles. Sometimes I have a sense from a reputation that somebody's particularly good at application. Sometimes, you know, there are people who, Garrett O'Connor, I don't know if that name is familiar to anybody in this audience. He was I don't think he's alive anymore. He was a dazzlingly brilliant alcoholic psychologist who had a capacity for large group work that I have never seen in my life. He could, at any moment, know who was sitting where, at any moment, and bring it back and reconstitute the membership. You get somebody with a talent like that, you use them.
You have a follow-up question, Jaime?
Well, a couple. I just wanted to leave space if anybody else want to jump in. I mean, because you said, you know, there's so many things that are unconscious that are happening. And so I wonder if you can give some examples of things that, examples of how the unconscious has been revealed given your staff selection.
I can't remember which conference this was. It was one of the conferences that I directed at Dover. There was a member of the staff from Italy who was silent, didn't speak in staff meetings, couldn't get him to speak. I tried to help the staff work with the silence, couldn't figure out what was happening to this staff member. The staff encouraged me to get angry at him. I wasn't interested in getting angry at him. I was interested in understanding what was happening. And they pushed me, and so I got angry at him. And he then spoke. And what he revealed was a central dynamic of the conference, which was the difference between, how did he do it? Oh, yes. For Italians, we were talking about the staff was talking about his lack of collaboration. That was the word they were using because he was so quiet. And after I yelled at him, he said, you know, during the war, a collaborator had a different meaning. And that opened an unconscious dynamic in the membership. And at the end of the conference, one of the members sent me a famous Italian painting that showed three figures leading a mob. And the three figures were the leadership of the conference. The representations were the people who were leading the mob. It was, you know, you learn a kind of dazzling, regressive engagement and social irrationality in a conference that you cannot get any other place. That's just one example. There have been many.
Thanks.
Lenny, do you want to?
Yeah, let me ask a question, Ed. So some of this has to do with your own identity, I think, Ed, as a white man and an elder in the crowd. But let me ask you this, because I wanted to go back to the article that you wrote. And I sort of wrote out my question, so I'm just going to read it to you slowly. It occurs to me that a certain amount of courage is required to commit to the role and to the conference enterprise. In your paper on learning from the director's role, you talk about the vulnerability of the director's role and how the felt vulnerability of the person in that role can be usable for both member and staff learning. And you wrote that the pressure on the director is to make that vulnerability available without losing the role. And it is the director's challenge to be aware of and respond to that vulnerability publicly in order that it might be used as a focus for projection. What would you like up and coming directors to understand about working with their experience of vulnerability?
I can give 3 examples of that phenomenon. Maybe more will occur to me. When I told you when I took over for Harry Holloway, I was nothing but vulnerable. I'd never directed a conference. I didn't hire the staff. I didn't know the venue. I hadn't talked to the membership. I didn't know anything. So I was in the role and I needed the staff to help me with it. So that was easy. That was public, was available and usable. In the 1990 conference, when Wesley resigned as the associate director, and I was in the middle of a divorce, and there was a psychotic member, carrying all of the tension of that conference made my vulnerability very public. And as some of you know, it mobilized irrationality in the A.K. Rice Institute. And I wrote a lot about that, so I don't want to talk about it very much because I've said everything I have to say about that event. But there was a staff member who seeing my vulnerability and working with it in that conference, a woman staff member, wrote to me after the conference and said to me, on retrospect, she said, I think everybody would have been happier if you had demonstrated your phallic arrogance rather than your vulnerability. It's a very interesting comment coming after the conference. And the other thing I want to say is that the grandfather transference is a lot easier to bear than the father transference. It's much easier to be vulnerable as a grandfather than it is as a father. The projections into fatherhood, particularly if you're a tall, white man and of fatherhood age, those projections some of which are obviously accurate, of arrogance and narcissism and power and control and all the rest of it, are very difficult to contend with, particularly if it's not the way you see yourself. So negotiating those projections is part of the work of the director and of every staff member for that matter. And managing it collectively is what faces all of us. But the learning involved is staggering.
So I want to ask a follow-up with that related to the projections that you'll get. Right? Can you talk about when that is happening? Parts of yourselves maybe that you could not bring in, that you found difficult, and how you dealt with that?
Well, I think that's really what I was talking about. I mean, to lead through vulnerability didn't come easily to me. I had to struggle with it. And my staff wasn't happy about allowing it. So a lot of that was in private, painful moments in my bedroom at the end of the day, which some of you who have directed must recognize.
So in that paper that you wrote about leadership and vulnerability, one of the questions that you raise at the end is this question about how much of the self can usefully be brought in light of also the necessary projective use, of the person. So I didn't know, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that sense, that paper.
That sentence was something I learned from a staff member. I had I'll try not to use names. I think it was probably the last conference I directed. I had a young Black woman who was a member of my staff. And in the final institutional event, there was like a half hour left. She had a brilliant formulation, which she was relatively inexperienced. She had a brilliant formulation, and we had a half hour left. And I said to her, bring that around to the membership. And she got up and she went to the door and she stopped. And she said, I can't do this. I said, why not? And she said, well, I haven't negotiated it with the rest of the staff. And I particularly haven't negotiated with my Black colleagues on the staff. And I said, I'm the director. We have 20 minutes left. The membership and the work need what you have come up with. Go. And she went. And when she and I had a long set of conversations about that. What does it mean to take authority for a young Black woman to take authority from a tall, old, white male director? And what aspects of her loyalty and other kinds of conflicts have to be put aside to privilege the director's role and the nature of the task? We had a long set of conversations about that, and I learned a lot about what it takes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm. Mm.
Well, maybe I can ask another question then. So Ed, you also write about, you wrote about, excuse me, the mutual vulnerability of the authority boundary. Can you say more what you mean by that?
Well, this again, this is learning that comes from the grandfather role there, and actually from this conversation tonight. I feel extraordinarily lucky to have had the range of experiences that I've had in my career. In particular, for the range of group relations experience. I've had a lot of group relations experience. And I feel driven to pass on what I have learned. That longing to transmit from the older generation to the younger generation is a mutual vulnerability. And it's dangerous. The longing of putting aside the aggressive components on both sides, and focusing just for the moment on the longing of the younger generation and the longing of the older generation. To what extent does that get met and articulated at the authority boundary in public?
Mhm.
And if you do it that way, what projections are you going to attract? Is it about sexuality? Is it about exploitation? Is it about all of the horrible negative projections that go into mutual learning that get in the way of the capacity of both generations to learn from each other? There was a conference, when I took up directing again after 1990, was like 20 years later. And the membership was busy in the first day talking about the 1990 conference. It blew me away. It was like ancient history. But how it was relevant to this particular conference was something that we had to discover. It was all about distortions and reputations and all of the insanity that goes into social and organizational life. And how you hold to the work of the conference in the midst of that welter of projections was not easy. I don't know, Lenny, if that addresses your question. But
No, I think it's just, we can all come back and talk about it some more to see what other people's thoughts are. And we'll come back to that piece. Because managing the authority boundary is like what we do. So, yeah.
it is what we do.
So let me ask you a couple of, Tommy, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, but I mean, maybe continue in this path because.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just really appreciating, talking about vulnerability and the painfulness that may come from that and all the projections. You said you deal with, kind of at the end of the day. And, I think there are no mistakes, but in the moment, some things may really feel like mistakes. So I'm wondering now.
I think there are only mistakes.
But I guess it seems like you've metabolized those mistakes and gained a lot. Right? So I guess that's an invitation just to talk about like what at the time just seemed like why, but then it's added to your understanding, your own capacity.
No, I've said this before, but if I had to condense everything I've learned in my career in a sentence, it would be listening for how the other person is right. That I found that extraordinarily difficult to learn and very difficult to teach. because it requires a discipline. Not that the other person is entirely right, but is it possible to listen to another person and attempt to discern what some aspect of what they're saying that resonates with your experience or with the task that you're trying to work at together? If you listen in that way, then you also begin to get interested in how you get it wrong. So how did I get it wrong this time? And what do we learn from it? Becomes, the learning edge. That's what I meant about there's only mistakes. You have to be, there's no way in human interaction you don't get it wrong all the time.
Hmm. I'm wondering if you can share anything about how you've had to grapple with the anxiety that arises in the staff, but in any of us, around a director making mistakes and not being the all-powerful, authoritarian leader that's going to keep everyone safe,
This is my learning about this from group relations work allowed me to be the medical director and CEO at RIGS. So when I came to RIGS, because of what I learned in conferences, I said to my staff, I need you to show me my blind spots, because by the very nature of blind spots, I can't see them. I am totally reliant on you to show me. And if you don't show me my blind spots, you will experience as power operations. And I do not want to lead by power. It took them a long time to believe that I meant what I was saying.
I can imagine.
But I meant what I was saying. And it made all the difference. And it came absolutely directly from what I had learned in group relations conference.
And that was tested, I'm sure, over and over again.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Your commitment to that, yeah.
I had the experience not infrequently. Some junior staff member would say something absolutely lucid about the task. And I would say, there's the answer to the question. And that made an enormous difference to the staff and to me.
Yeah, just to keep the focus on the task, to be led by the task is really what you're talking about.
Yeah, the problem these days is how to negotiate the task. And institutions that I consult to, if you ask people about the mission, it's usually some 6 pages of repetitive platitudes. And the work of negotiating a mission that everybody can hold, that links to their values and beliefs, and that matters to them and guides their work, that you don't just assert it, you discover it. And that's increasingly complicated, it seems to me, in the group relations world, because the controversy about what's called social justice and what's called the study of authority, as if they were different, for me is mystifying. And I'm trying to learn something about it.
So related to that, do you mind, Lenny?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. The question of how do you choose a conference theme, and how does that tie into how you conceptualize or talk about the task and so on?
Yeah, I had a very interesting disagreement with Charlotte Hayden about this, because she thinks choosing a conference theme is off task, that it pulls people away from a study of authority. And I disagree with that. And so if all conferences are simply about the study of authority, then very easily everybody's thinking it's the same conference. And no conference is the same. So from my perspective, the theme is a sub-theme, and it's chosen sometimes by the director, sometimes by a discussion between the director and the sponsoring organization. It's marketing. It's an effort to put out into the world the director's picture of the nature of the authority struggle in the world now. And so it becomes a recruiting mechanism. You put it out as your best guess about how authority is being managed in the world that might actually interest people in coming and participating in the conference. It's marketing.
Right. So we can say that the broader social issues always find their ways into conferences, and
Always.
it sounds like this is a bit of advice for up and coming directors about how to consider that.
I also increasingly, I mean, this is a little mystical, so forgive me, but I believe that people are chosen to direct conferences for reasons, and that the nature of that choice, the nature of the sponsoring organization, is an effort, is a collective, represents a collective effort to articulate something about the world. I think we are, all of us in this work, are struggling to advance this work toward a greater social understanding of collective irrationality. That's what we do. And I think each of us in our own way represents some aspect of that. And when we're chosen either for director roles or staff roles, we're chosen for a reason. And that reason in conferences can be discovered. It can't be asserted, but it can be discovered.
What do you think people should do who would like to direct? I mean, we're talking about, how does this, how many, you get tapped. I got tapped by my mentor. Now it's your turn to direct,
This is
people who want to sort of self-authorize or find the sponsoring organization who would like them to do that. How would you advise folks on that?
I don't believe in self-authorization. I don't think it exists. I think what gets called self-authorization has to do with your family role. You're authorized by an organization. It doesn't come from the self. If somebody wants to direct, they should go be a member. And if they want, let me back off from that. There has been through most of my career, actually I participated in this, a tension between the way people used to be selected to direct and to be on staff, and the effort that ACRI has advanced toward formalizing the training. This was you know what I mean? It used to be when I started this work that a director would see some talent in some members, and they would find ways to encourage that talent. Not everybody has the talent to do this kind of interpretive work. And when I started out, that's what directors would do. They'd find somebody like Margaret did with me. You should do this. That got quickly incorporated into the political life of ACRI, and it became seen as the old boy network, in part because Margaret, in some ways projectively, was seen as only favoring men and not favoring women. And that controversy was part of why I had a training group in the 1990 conference, because I wanted to try to make the criteria for choosing a director public rather than private. That was a terrible idea. It was well intended, but it was a terrible idea, because what happened, I mean, it had pluses and minuses. The plus side, at the end of the conference, Shala and Wesley had developed 4 criteria, public criteria, for selecting staff people. The downside was that 2 members of the training group didn't meet the criteria. And so they were publicly embarrassed. And that was hideous for them and painful for the membership. So it was a failed experiment. 4 criteria came out of that conference, and ACRI, in its wisdom, developed those 4 criteria into 4,000 criteria and developed a training program that, in my view, was highly obsessive and caused all kinds of trouble. And now it's waning. And what we're going back to, I'm not sure. I still think that people need to recognize talent and encourage people to go for it.
Do you have another question, Lenny? Or?
Well, I was just going to sort of, yeah, just, maybe one more question and then maybe we'll open it up to everybody, unless you guys have some other things you want to ask. I was going to say, what are the most, just kind of a summary question, I guess. What are the most important things you would like to tell someone who is starting to direct?
I've had several people who are starting to direct come talk to me
Mm-hmm.
about directing before they started to do it. And that's been wonderful. I mean, in my experience, you don't tell people what to learn. They tell you what they want to know. And they ask the kinds of questions, and you get led by what they want to know, not by what you want to teach. So somebody who wants to direct should talk to the director about the experience. I think that's incredibly valuable. Yeah. Just like this, which I'm glad I really appreciate you inviting me to do this, because I have a drive to pass on as best I can, as you can tell by my book, as best I can what I have learned. I felt very lucky to have learned what I've learned.
Well, and we do have on our website, we have sort of surveyed the membership of experienced folks who would like to serve as mentors for folks that would
I think it's really important.
The role. And so we have a whole list. If people are curious, they can check that out or maybe get added to it if they are inclined. But so we do have a venue for checking that out, for people getting some guidance or input. Yeah.
I also think that if you're on a staff and you watch the director and you don't understand something about the director's experience, you should ask. I can't imagine a director who wouldn't answer those questions.
Yeah.
So earlier you said something about, a director is not self-authorized. They're authorized by an organization. So I'm wondering, can you say more about the relationship with that sponsoring organization and managing that?
Yeah. I'm hesitating because it's a complicated subject. Some sponsoring organizations are clear about authorizing the director to direct. Some sponsoring organizations have so many political commitments that they constrain the director's freedom. One of the conferences, I can't remember, it was a long time ago, I had to choose 2 from this category and 2 from this category and these kind of trainees and the kinds of, it was like Gulliver being tied down with little strings. And we all learned from it, but it was a tightly managed authorization that was constrained. The nature of that conversation should have a consultant to it, because there's something to be learned from the way that conversation goes. And not infrequently in our group relations organizations, there are people running them who don't have a lot of conference experience. And so when they're in charge of authorizing the director, they're not very clear about the nature of that process. And it's a really important process. The other thing I would say about it is, given my 1990 experience, is don't hire members of the sponsoring organization to be on your staff. It's a terrible idea. Don't do it.
They should go as members.
They can go as members, but don't hire your boss.
Interesting.
Well, I would say that is practical, and there are plenty of situations where, because of who's available, that sometimes that happens, and it does present a real kind of layered, knotty situation.
I could read you chapter and verse about that, but I won't. I wrote about it.
I think we should open up the discussion now to all the other people that are in the room here with us. And you want to put your cameras on and raise your hands, and we'll see how we can organize.
Yeah, please put your cameras on. I'd like to see you.
Put your cameras on, and if I don't see much in the
Okay.
chat, if you had put something, there's nothing in the chat that we need to
No, not yet.
tend to. Maybe if you want to, we'll check the chat as we go along. But time for comments, thoughts, questions, agitations, suggestions.
Ed, thank you, by the way, for all you've shared and the jokes and the painful moments too, I'm hearing. I want to say a little bit about, you were talking about the sponsoring organizations, and there's another piece to it where it seems like you also want to get a co-sponsor. Can you say a little bit about that relationship? So there's sponsorships, co-sponsors, and I don't know that always gets looked at in terms of the conference, the co-sponsors. Yeah. Can you say more?
Yeah, it's a great question. Co-sponsorship matters if it's real. If it's just putting another name on the brochure, it doesn't actually matter. It's a gimmick. But if you can negotiate with affiliated organizations, so if you're the director, and they know actually what you have in mind, and you figure out with them a conversation so they feel like you actually represent their work, that kind of co-sponsorship matters, because then if you can show them that you represent what they stand for, they will recruit for you. And recruiting should not just be on the head of the director.
Okay, thank you.
Come on, you guys, you must have questions to ask.
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on something you said that piqued my curiosity about, like, if I'm remembering correctly, that about not hiring friends. And you know, in some ways, it's very clear what you're talking about. But on the other hand, people become friends within this organization, and
Absolutely true.
And often these are boundaries that need to be negotiated, whether between director and staff or staff to staff or whatever it may be. And I wonder if you want to share more about negotiating that.
Yeah, thank you, Lori, for that question. So let me try to clarify that. My experience is that the people I have worked with and staffs and group relations conferences are some of the most intimate relationships I have in life. They get inside, I carry them around with me. I recognize their voices inside of me. So, you know, are they friends? I don't know what they are, but they're people I have learned from, struggled with, bled with. You know, these are profoundly intimate relationships. And some of those people I would hire on my staff. That's, you know, it's a tricky call. But even then, when I have people that I feel that way about, and I decide to hire them, I have a conversation with them. Because I've been burnt by it. A very important question.
And what would you say? I mean, do you raise the potential for risk to the friendship? You know?
I say, Wesley Carr, my closest working colleague, tried to kill me. That's what I say. And that's the beginning of the conversation.
Hey, Ed, you said something.
Sorry, one other thing. One thing I learned from that 1990 conference, as awful as it was, I learned they can only kill you once. Everything else is a metaphor.
Ray, were you going to ask a question?
I guess it's a question. It's more,
Make a comment.
yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts, Ed, about a classic model would be an established group relations organization wants to put on a conference and hires a particular director to direct the conference sponsored by the organization. But sometimes we see conferences that are directed by directors who really are initiating on their own. They want to direct the conference. They may have some idea that's not coming out of an established organization, or maybe they're frustrated that they haven't been able to get directorships from an established organization. So they really go out on their own and they develop conferences, direct conferences. And I think a lot of times these are really, really, really good conferences. They can be really very creative, very strong. Sometimes they get a kind of a nominal sponsorship, but they're really driven more by the individual. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the differences, what to look for, how to think about, these different ways of taking on a director role.
We have a world that has been advanced by explorers. People who have gotten the bug, go out and explore and create something that's on their own, that may be in various ways influenced by a tradition, maybe not. And some of them are disasters, and some of them are usable. I mean, there are lots of examples of it. I mean, just Jeffrey Roth's work in China is a very good example of a developing, exploratory, risky engagement with a culture that we didn't know very much about. And as I've not been in any of those conferences, so I don't speak from experience, but working in a language that you don't speak, I've done that online with a Eastern European conference that he directed. And it was amazing. It was not like the kind of conference that I'm accustomed to working in. It's a gamble. Whether, I mean, it's just a different form of authorization. And whether that authority gets explored in those kinds of conferences, I'm not sure, because I've never been in one. But I wouldn't dismiss them. We learn by people taking risks.
So I got one for you. Good to see you, Ed. Long time no see. So I was standing in line trying to get some food, so I wasn't exactly sure if I heard the word right. I think you said loci of projection. Is that the word that you used?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I get that. I get that in spades, because I know what that looks. But could you have what's your thought about? And I'm just making this up because I'm thinking about what it would be to direct and choose people to have loci of containment. In other words, how do we advance the learning by finding people who could do that? So you said I had to take 2 of these and 2 of these and 4 of those to make up my staff, which is a containing function, maybe, but it also is, as the director, it's like, okay, now I have to think about, because somebody required me, which is also a process in and of itself. But I'm thinking about some of those, for instance, the 1996 conference, the Black Conference, right? Or Zachary's conference on the matter of Black lives. Those were specifically chosen to create containing spaces. Do you see where I'm going with this? Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm just being curious.
I don't have any problem with just choosing people without noticing what they may represent in your mind. I don't have any problem with that. If you choose, I've been in conversations now about creating a conference just for men. because the problem of men in America is a serious problem. And to do that raises a whole set of interesting questions. That it depends on what's on the table. An all-black conference seems to me perfectly reasonable to do. I wouldn't presume, however, Ty, that what you've done is provide a locus of containment. Containment is a psychological capacity that is developed in particular contexts around particular issues. It's not something you assert. It's something you discover. So the containment in a conference is managed by the clarity of the boundaries and by the clarity of the task.
Cool. That was helpful. Thank you.
And just to come back to the other thing you said, when I can't remember which conference this was, but when I had to choose a staff member from every ACRI center, plus 3 trainees who were in the training program, I had to think, because that was the negotiation. They were hiring under those conditions. I had to think about how that constraint furthered the task. And where because I had to negotiate it then with the staff that I had gathered. And I said, here's how you got here in the room. What do we represent? What kind of authority are we looking at in terms of developing this work and spreading it around the country and all of the rest of that? How does that relate to this conference? And so we had a serious staff conversation about what that meant. I mean, all of that it's part of the opening staff discussion. Why are we here? Why this group? What do we say? What do we represent? And how are we going to put our arms around this conference with this membership? This is the work of the staff. I wouldn't presume to assert that none of these things are possible. I just wouldn't. And particularly since, you know, the wide, let me back up. In psychoanalysis, American and international psychoanalytic establishments have recognized that constraining their work to one person on a couch and one analyst sitting behind is too limiting. And so they are beginning, against enormous resistance, to think about the world around them, the social context, the dynamics of groups. All of that stuff is creeping its way into psychoanalytic institutes because we're living in a psychotic world. And if we don't use the technologies we have, not just psychoanalysis, but group relations work, to understand it, then it will do to us what it has done to so many before us. I hope you can tell how passionate I am about this work, because I am.
I have a question related to what you're talking about, the context around us, perhaps now more than other times, seems to be, you know, on a heightened kind of irrational plane. Can you give examples of how there may have been some members who've been so loaded up that it may have been dangerous for them, or, you know, really disruptive, and maybe how you intervened or saw that play out?
Well, I had a psychotic member in the 1990 conference, and I managed it quite badly. And we managed it quite badly. You know, the discussions through the years about how you think about a psychotic or disorganized member have been fascinating and controversial. Do you, as I thought we did initially, do you assume that a disorganized member is a product of the system? And do you work it systemically? Do you allow yourself, if the director is a psychiatrist, to get mobilized by a delineated member to take up the treater role and lose sight of the authority role. There are 1,000 questions that come up around what you do with this organization. There's a whole endless controversy. Do you give a trigger warning on the brochure? If you're going to be psychotic, don't come to the I mean, it's insane. And it's all the bureaucratic anxiety about what is actually very risky work that we do. There is no answer to that question that I've been happy with. You figure it out in the moment. But those kinds of why this person gets disorganized and not that person. I mean, this is what happens in society. The guy who brings a hammer to Pelosi's house, he got mobilized by, everybody has a theory about it. We don't know the answer to this question, but it is something that faces every director and staff. And this conference is going to be different management intervention than the last conference. You have to figure it out in the moment. And you cannot do it alone as the director. You can only do it with your staff.
So, Ed, that's a good question about not doing it alone. Some conferences have an associate director. I guess wanting to know more about the usefulness of that. Well, not just the usefulness. When is it? I don't even know the question, but if it's just when you're talking about the staff, are you also including the associate director or just your
Of course.
consultants?
No, associate
the
director is a
associate.
member of the staff. Associate director
Right.
is a member of the staff.
Yes. So some conferences don't have one. It's the director and the consultants.
Yeah.
So maybe the question is, what is the motivation for having or not having an associate director, I guess?
Well, the formal reason to have an associate director is like what happened to me when Harry Holloway withdrew. If the director dies, you need somebody to take up the role. And you can leave that in the staff and have them figure it out, or you can have an associate director just in case. Sometimes you have an associate director if you're doing, depending on the nature of the conference. If you're doing an A-B conference, for example, you have an associate director who runs the A conference or the B conference, and the director runs the A. That depends on the nature of the design of the conference as to whether you have an associate director. If there's a job, it's better. Sometimes you have an associate director because, like you're about to step into the director role, and you are formally visible as the next director. And so you're in a projected place that's public, which is usable by the membership to think about the future. It's all of our work is about representation, all of it. It's not about me as a person. It's about what I represent.
Succession, yeah.
Whatever it is, people respond to you because human beings are infinitely complicated. It's not possible, in my view, to understand another person. They are forever a mystery. The best we can do is to struggle with it. But you can understand what they represent to you. And if you face what you represent, I write about this. I've talked about this a lot recently. I had this experience in a conference where I was consulting to a small group, and a young Black psychiatrist said to me, a woman, "When you speak, my mind goes blank." And I have thought about that sentence for a year. I wrote a paper about it. And here's what I've been thinking about. For her, she made it very clear, it had nothing to do with what I was saying. It had nothing to do with my ideas. When I spoke, her mind went blank because of what I represented to her. And what I represented had to do with the history of slavery. Now, my grandparents came from the Ukraine. So my instinctive response to that is not me. But when you face what you represent to somebody else, particularly if it's a negative set of projections, one of the things you do is you join history. If my American identity means anything to me, then I have to accept that as a white man, even though my grandparents came from the Ukraine, I represent that history of slavery. And so I have to take on board a negative set of projections about what I represent, and I have to find how that is me. That takes work. And that work is the heart of group relations work. It's extraordinarily difficult to do. But that's where the edge of my learning is now.
Mhm.
You can't say not me.
Right.
It's really helpful, Ed.
Hi, Ed. Very nice to see you.
It's
I-
great to see you, Medea.
Absolutely. I was making it a point to be here tonight. I cleared my schedule and everything to be able to show up.
I'm glad you're here.
I don't have a question, but I have to say I feel so deeply moved by what you are saying here tonight. I feel vulnerable. I feel teary even.
Me too. Thank you.
Just, and I want to let you know, yes, your passion is very much there. And I just appreciate the way you're talking about the complexity of what we are living through right now, and moving back and forth between the boundary of what's happening within the context of a group relations conference and what's happening in the world, and trying to make sense of all of that in
Yep.
what feels like perilous times.
Very.
So
I appreciate your tears. I share them with you.
I
We are
just
up
feel-
against quite a lot.
Mhm.
This is what this work that we do
Mhm.
is really important. It's a discovery. You know, one of the things I talk about, when Freud figured out the couch,
Mhm.
it's a nutty setup. And it doesn't correspond to anything in human experience,
Mhm.
but it opens up the unconscious mind.
Mhm.
And the group relations conference is a similar kind of nutty, mad
Mhm.
structure that opens up the social unconscious, dazzling.
Mhm.
And preserving it matters. So this is on you.
I want to go back to this, and it relates to that sentence, it can only kill you once. There's something about that that really stays with me, because I can imagine resisting being killed off, resisting whatever's coming. And then on the other hand, kind of experiencing it and making it useful. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
It took me a decade to recover from 1990. It was an absolutely devastating, hideous experience. My beloved organization turned on me. And it was terrible. You know, there was a, God, what's the name? Chestnut Lodge. Chestnut Lodge was a residential treatment center, not unlike the Austin Rig Center. And it died. It failed and it died. And the people who worked at Chestnut Lodge will never get over it. They carry that wound around with them throughout the rest of their career. To have my beloved organization use me in the way that organization did was hideous. And it took me a long time to get through it. A long time. A lot of analysis, a lot of writing,